but as I say, the sense of people can make it.
Sorry, can you hear me, Christopher?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
You can still hear me.
I
Oh,
can still hear you. I can hear the dog start barking in the background.
speaking of, I mean that could have been someone having a midlife crisis. It's basically someone's drove past the house with the stereo blaring
Oh, right.
in a sports car. So I hope, just for the sake of this interview, that he was at least 60 years old. Okay, good afternoon, spring chickens and November turkeys. My name's Danny. This is my own worst enemy, mental health podcast and all that malarkey. Okay, just quickly, I don't know if you can hear. Got a bit of a bad throat. My missus is going to give me the lurgy. Don't know where she's got it from. Probably don't want to know. But I'm not sure how this intro is going to go. I'm either going to sort of increasingly sound like Barry White as we go on, which wouldn't be such a bad thing, to be honest, or I'm going to sound like one of those sort of squeaky, pubescent 12-year-old boys whose voice is breaking. So that should be interesting. Let's see how that goes. Okay, so today we are talking about the midlife crisis. And right up until yesterday, this was going to be sort of one of those rare occasions where, instead of using this intro like a public therapy session to sort of vent my neuroses like I usually do, I was just going to sort of get straight down to business and introduce today's guest. But then something quite interesting happened yesterday evening. Okay, so my midlife crisis, right, and I talk about this a little bit during the interview. My midlife crisis came about as soon as I hit 30. I'm 35 now. And it was basically because 30 for me had always sort of been the deadline for sort of achieving all the things I wanted to, like, have achieved in life. I remember I was like listening to Tony Robbins' Personal Power 2 back in the day, and was getting, all enthusiastic about the future and sort of writing my goals down and all that sort of thing. And what I did is, rather than just sort of write them down and stash them away in a notepad or whatever, I printed them out on this little business card type thing that I used to sort of carry around in my wallet. And the heading on it was something like, "By the time I'm 30, dot dot dot," and then there was like a list of goals. And I used to use this as like a source of inspiration for, every time I felt myself sort of being a bit like lazy or unmotivated or whatever, I'd take this card out to sort of remind myself, like, the clock's ticking, motherfucker, and to sort of give me a bit of a kick up the arse. Anyway, basically, by the time I hit 30, I hadn't just not achieved any of my goals. I was actually further away from achieving them than when I'd sort of first written them down in my early 20s. And this proper sort of messed me up. I remember I genuinely felt like any sort of shot I had at like giving my life any sort of meaning or whatever was sort of dead in the water. Back then it was like, your 20s were all that mattered. And as soon as you hit 30, it's sort of, you goosed, it's all downhill from there. And I really believed it. But my midlife crisis didn't really consist of the, sort of like buying a heavy metal guitar and wearing cowboy boots and all that sort of thing. Mine was just sort of more introspective, sort of lamenting the past and, sort of driving past cemeteries with like a sense of impending doom. Anyway, so I worked through it all, a lot of thinking, philosophizing, and sort of reevaluating things. And I kind of started to think I was over it. But then, yesterday, so I kind of, I told you a couple of episodes ago, we've been having a bit of car drama recently. So, the old one broke down out of the blue. Bought a new one, got shafted on that. That was a ringer, completely broke down the day after I bought it. Anyway, 5 weeks later, it's been 5 weeks, still looking for a replacement. Every single day we've been at it, right? Scouring through Auto Trader, been to see a few, had a few test drives and what have you. But because I've had my fingers burned, I've turned into like whatever the used car salesman equivalent of a racist is. I've had one bad experience, and now they're all the same as far as I'm concerned. I don't trust any of them. And they say that, don't tar everyone with the same brush. I'm tarring, not bothered, right? So the first one, just quickly, I'll just run you through them. The first one, he tried conning me out of like £700 for admin fees. The second guy, he's the one that sold me a complete ringer and then made me wait 2 weeks for a refund. Third guy, he tried using all this like ridiculous reverse psychology on me to try and make a sale. So just quickly with him, the car we went to see, I told the guy selling it what had happened, and I said I want to get it checked over by a garage because I'm not having that happen to me again. And he's at it like, it's fine, mate. If you don't want it, I could sell this thing 10 times over. And I'm like, well, I'm not bothered. I still want to get it checked. So he says, well, I'll get my guy to check it out for you. And it's like, no thanks. Then he tries questioning my autonomy. He's at it. He says, it's fine getting someone else's opinion, but at the end of the day, mate, if it was me, I'd rather make my own mind up for myself, rather than let someone else do it for me. Like, nope, nice try. I'm like a brick wall, right? I'm thinking, don't try this psychology bullshit on me, sunshine. Yeah, this is my bread and butter. Then his last-ditch attempt at convincing me not to take it to get it checked was, get this, he says, oh, see, mate, the problem with garages is they love finding things wrong with cars. The problem with garages is they love finding things wrong with cars, yeah? No shit, scruffy Sherlock. That's exactly what I want him to do. Anyway, so he gives on, right, desperate to get a sale, obviously. So much for being able to sell it 10 times over. I take it to get it checked, which cost me 70 quid. Guess what? It's knackered. Again, what a surprise. What else? Fourth guy drove an hour to go and see a Land Rover that was advertised as a stunning example. It was stunning, stunningly shit, yeah? And then I had another guy, the last guy, he looked me dead in the eye, right? Told me that this car he was selling was in tip-top condition, nothing wrong with it, right? We went and checked the MOT. It had something like 17 advisories on it. Worked out at something like £2,000 worth of repairs needed doing on it. Honestly, I'm at the point now, right, where if Donald Trump offered to come over here now, right, and chuck all the used car salesmen out of the country and then build a wall to keep them all out, I'd vote for him. I'm sick of him. But think, right, I'm on it now. What are the chances of that, right? 5 cars, 5 different companies, 5 different salesmen, yeah? Every single one of them a lying bastard, yeah, trying to screw me over. And it's not even like they've been sort of interspersed with people who weren't so bad. I've only been to see 5 cars in total. That's 5 for 5. That's a 100% scumbag rating. And I'm thinking, I genuinely think there's an episode there, like the psychology of used car salesmen. People who contribute nothing of value, they take no pride in the work, they go out of the way to source sort of aesthetically pleasing but mechanically substandard products for the express purpose of mis-selling them at inflated prices, and sort of spend their entire day lying and trying to con people out of the money. That's pathological. And I've just noticed as well how sort of similar that is to the banking industry as well, just to get an extra dig in there. Anyway, so, given all this nonsense, I'm proper on pins now. I'm sick of cars. I'm sick of used car salesmen. I'm super cautious. But yesterday, I'm on Auto Trader. I come across a Ford Mondeo ST220. Now, this is probably maybe an anecdote just for the boy racers. Anyway, when this car came out, like 2003, I was something like 21 years old. And I was mad into cars, right? Especially Fords, they were my thing. And there was 2 cars back then that were sort of the titans of Ford performance cars. There was the Focus RS and the Mondeo ST220. The Focus was like it's like a 2-litre turbo hatchback, a bit chavvy. It was like a boy racer car. Whereas the Mondeo, that felt more like, it's like a man's car. It's a bit more sophisticated, like 3-litre V6, 220 brake horsepower, had like Recaro leather seats. And but back then they were like 20 grand brand new. 16 years later, right, I stumble across this Mondeo for 2,500, right? Now, again, remember, this is a 3-litre V6, right? It's like, does like 20 miles to the gallon, which is rubbish. The car we've got at the minute does something like 60. Insurance is through the roof. Car tax, that's something like 300 quid a year. It's about the same as having like a massive 4x4. Not to mention, I can't afford this car in the first place. It's already over budget. And, I'm supposed to be buying like a family-friendly car, something to cart the kids and the dogs around in, go shopping, do the school run, that sort of thing. But I couldn't help it. I must have sat there for about 2 hours cooing over this car that I used to idolise and trying every cognitive trick in the book to try and rationalize why this would be a perfectly reasonable purchase for me to make. And the thing about it is, like nothing wrong with wanting to buy a new car, right? But I haven't thought about this particular car for maybe 13 years. And I got bored of the whole car obsession altogether when I was about, I don't know, 25 or something. So my motivations for sort of wanting to buy this car, they definitely weren't based on any sort of practical considerations. And they weren't even based on nostalgia. I've never owned this car. I've never even sat in one. So this must have been just me just wanting to buy a car for no other reason than like this juvenile delusion that it'd make me look cool. And what's mad about that is what was it? The allure was so strong, like almost irresistible. Like I'm sort of joking about it, but I genuinely had to fight myself not to find a reason to buy it. So I'm thinking, like, if that's me now at 35, sort of flirting with these embarrassing, reckless, immature purchases, I've got no chance when I'm 50. I am going to be that sort of old guy in the club with, like, the leather jacket with the studs all down the sleeves, like, one big hoop earring with a skull and crossbones on it. I'll be, like, grey hair going bald. I'm already going bald, but, like, in a ponytail, body popping on the dance floor in some sort of pathetic attempt to try and lure 21-year-old girls back to my convertible sports car, which would be parked outside with sort of flame stickers running down the side of it. Oh, God, something for us all to look forward to there. Okay, so anyway, let's get on with it. Okay, so my guest today is Dr. Christopher Hamilton. Christopher is a senior lecturer in the philosophy of religion at King's College London, where he teaches philosophy, literature, and film. His research interests include the relationship between philosophy and literature, and between moral, religious, and aesthetic value, the nature of good and evil, the philosophy of tragedy, and the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard? Soren Kierkegaard? I don't know. Soren Kierkegaard, yeah? We're in Manchester, bollocks to it. It's like that other guy, existential French philosopher, Albert Camus. Like, no sunshine. In Manchester, you're Albert Camus, I'm afraid. Anyway, back to my guest, Christopher Hamilton. So, Christopher is the author of a number of books, including How to Deal with Adversity, A Philosophy of Tragedy, and the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, which is Middle Age, from the Art of Living series. In today's episode, we discuss the philosophy of middle age and the midlife crisis. So, what does it mean to be middle-aged? When does middle age start, and why does it matter? We discuss the relationship between the midlife crisis and such things as loss of identity, the search for meaning, and the fear of death. We ask why the crisis of middle age tends to be a uniquely male phenomenon, whether or not our cultural worship of youthfulness is justified, reasons why the midlife crisis can sometimes find expression in immature and reckless behaviour, but also why purchasing a leather jacket and a convertible sports car, or a Mondeo ST220, might not necessarily be such a bad thing. As usual, all the show notes and book recommendations will be available in the show notes, either in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube, or on the website. Just go to myownworstenemy.org. As always, if you find this podcast helpful, you enjoy it, you want to help support it, you can make a one-time donation for as little as £1, or if you fancy subscribing for as little as £2 a month, you can now gain access to exclusive content, such as my monthly Ask Me Anything episodes, the next episode of which will be available at the end of this month. Anyway, let's not sort of stand on ceremony. None of us is getting any younger. In fact, you're now about 10 minutes closer to death than you were at the start of this introduction. So, please, everyone, don your leather jackets and your ripped jeans, and please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Christopher Hamilton. Okay, Christopher Hamilton, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so jumping back into the realm of philosophy today. Today we're talking about. Originally I contacted you to talk about the midlife crisis, but I think we're going to kind of go a bit broader than that and just talk about midlife in general. I think it sort of deserves its own its own discussion.
Yes.
And the other thing is as well, I've noticed as I was sort of doing a bit of research and stuff for this interview, the midlife crisis, it's sort of a, some people say it doesn't exist. It's not its own distinct phenomenon. It's
Mm.
and it's just sort of made up, or it's cultural. Whereas midlife, just by virtue of mathematics, midlife is a thing. So
Yeah.
I feel this episode is justified just on that basis alone.
Mm.
But before we jump into all this, if you could tell us and the listeners a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, in a more broader sense than just the topic we're talking about today, and then we'll sort of dig into things a little bit from there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as you say, my name's Christopher Hamilton. I teach philosophy at King's College London, and I'm actually based in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, because although there is a philosophy department at King's, there's also a Theology and Religious Studies department, and that has a number of philosophers who teach in there. And we have an interest not simply in philosophy, but also the connection between philosophy and religion and philosophy of religion. So that's where I teach, and I teach philosophy from an interdisciplinary perspective. So I'm extremely interested in the relationship between philosophy and literature and philosophy and film. And one of the things that I do in my work is to try and bring these disciplines into connection with each other, partly because, well, it seems to me completely obvious that the great poets and the great novelists and the great playwrights are thinking about just the same things that philosophers are thinking about. Namely, they're thinking about good and evil. They're thinking about concepts of betrayal, of trust. They're thinking about love. They're thinking about God, and lots of other things, including metaphysics. What is it to be a human being, and what is it to make sense of our lives? And so I'm very much interested in philosophy from this interdisciplinary point of view. And as I sometimes say to my students, in fact, I have this idea that the different disciplines that one studies at university or that one can read, such as philosophy or sociology or anthropology, or political science or literature, languages, these are kind of, for me, different windows on the same perplexing thing. And that perplexing thing is human beings. We don't fully understand ourselves. We're creatures who constantly put ourselves into question, wonder what we are, think about our relationship to ourselves, to each other, to animals, to the material world. And these disciplines I think of as just windows on to that, with slightly different emphases, and that's why we call one philosophy and another psychology. But to me, they're complementary and they're looking at the same thing. So it seems silly to me to think of philosophy as dealing with a certain set of texts and literature as a certain different set of texts. Rather, the interdisciplinarity, the way in which these texts can complement each other seems to me extremely important. So that's the kind of general approach I take. And I'm particularly interested in questions in ethics. I'm interested in questions of in religion. And I guess at the most fundamental level, what I'm really interested in is how do people make sense of their lives? And I got into philosophy in that way, partly because of personal experiences, and partly because I had read people like Nietzsche, great German philosopher Nietzsche, when I was very young. Hadn't understood a word of it, but felt there was something terribly important going on. So I came to philosophy with existential questions. I wanted to understand philosophical questions, but I wanted to understand them because I thought they could help me understand myself. And so for me, that's a crucial thing. So now when I teach, when I write, that's a constant concern of mine. How is it that people have made sense of parts of their lives or their whole life? How do we make sense of each other? So at the most general level, I'm interested in that question of the meaning of life. And when I was younger, that's to say when I first started studying philosophy in the 1980s, very, very few English-speaking philosophers would have worried about it. It would have been considered a rather embarrassing question to raise in a seminar at the university. But now, plenty of people have written on this, and I've done some writing on it myself too, in a direct and also indirect manner. And so that's been a change in academic philosophy, which I think is all to the good. So that sort of situates me in terms of the kinds of stuff I do, and I'm particularly interested in. So I've written on tragedy, and I've written on people like Nietzsche and great Danish philosopher, the so-called father of existentialism, Kierkegaard. And at the moment, I'm writing a book on philosophy and autobiography.
Well, I've got a question, but sort of jumping back. But I've just got to ask. When you were saying then that it would have been sort of embarrassing to approach the meaning of life sort of questions in British philosophy at the time, why was that?
Well, because most English-speaking philosophy, and a great deal of other philosophy now also, is what's called analytic philosophy. And this is a philosophy which basically came about towards the end of the 19th century and was taken up, or what two of the key developers of this kind of philosophy were G. Moore and Bertrand Russell, both at the University of Cambridge. And I think the ambition, I mean, there are many ways of understanding what this particular type of philosophy was or is, but part of it was an attempt to try and explore philosophical questions by very close analysis of particular concepts, hence analytic philosophy. And part of the idea was that previous philosophers had tried to develop huge metaphysical systems to explain existence, to understand human beings, and it was felt that these were kind of wildly speculative in a way, and that what was needed was a much closer, narrower analysis of particular philosophical concepts. And often the idea there was to take very simple examples and seek to explore them. So a classic one was, I'm obliged to take my book back to the library that I borrowed. Why should I take it back? Where does this notion of obligation come from? And so there was a tendency within English-speaking moral philosophy to concentrate on these very narrow, very small, very simple examples, in the hope that if one could understand the simple example, it would be possible then to understand things, larger problems about moral dilemmas or whatever it might be. And so there was a kind of embarrassment about these big questions, and a feeling that what should be done is a focus on smaller things. So out of that developed, or that was part of this development of analytic philosophy, which in many ways is a very valuable way of doing philosophy. It places great emphasis on clarity of argument, on organizing the thoughts well, on speaking to the reader in a way that the reader can understand. But it has a tendency to lose these very big questions from view, which therefore became rather embarrassing, and analytic philosophers weren't really sure how they could deal with those questions. I mean, one example would be that to think about the meaning of life, I mean, you've got to bring in not just concepts, but you've got to bring in questions about, the moral imagination, for example. And analytic philosophy, in its narrow analysis of concepts, found it very hard to bring that kind of material in. So this kind of philosophy developed in one way, and so-called continental philosophy, the kind of philosophy which was done in large parts of Germany, but particularly in France, developed in another way. And now people sometimes talk about analytic philosophy versus continental philosophy. I think most people now regard that distinction as not terribly well drawn. But that was at any rate why, it would have been considered rather embarrassing to focus on those larger questions at that time. And that's changed in, as I say, the last 30 or 40 years, partly because various analytic philosophers started to get more interested in those questions, and either indirectly or directly talk about them. And so now there are lots of interesting books in analytic moral philosophy on the meaning of life. My own view is that one still needs to bring in these other great thinkers, the earlier philosophers and novelists and so on, and playwrights, and that analytic philosophy hasn't quite fully made its peace with those kinds of questions. But at any rate, that's why it was like that in the early 1980s or mid-1980s.
Yeah, well, just sort of... Oh, sorry, go on, Christopher.
No, I was just going to say, which is strange, because you'd think if philosophy is anything, it is seeking to think about the meaning of life. So it seems surprising, but there's no question that during the 20th century, philosophers would have been very embarrassed about that. And there were other reasons. There was a movement in the early part of the 20th century known as logical positivism, which essentially also, and this is an important thing to mention, gave to philosophy the idea that what philosophy should really be doing is modeling itself on the natural sciences. and that perhaps even the only thing that philosophy could do is to talk about the sciences and clear up conceptual confusions that might be in the sciences. So those bigger questions, which clearly are not, I mean, the question of the meaning of life is clearly not a scientific question, then were considered, unacceptable within that kind of framework. This idea of philosophy is thinking so much about science and modelling it on science, wanting the kind of results that science could give, in that sense, objective truths that everyone could agree on. And I think it's now widely accepted amongst philosophers that philosophy has much more to do than just be, as it were, handmaiden to science. So that's another reason that went along with this development of analytic philosophy, to exclude those kinds of bigger questions. And so when I went to university as an undergraduate, I was rather disappointed, because I wanted to be talking about the meaning of life, and people weren't doing this at all. But unfortunately, now the situation has changed, as I say.
Yeah, funnily, back when I first started with this podcast, I thought a good first episode to be when a podcast talking about psychology, mental health, would be to go straight back to basics and ask the question, what is mental illness?
Yes.
And so my first ever interview I did, which never got published, was with an analytic philosopher from Oxford.
Yes.
And we did get caught up in the linguistics and semantics of what do we mean by what do we mean by mental, what do we mean by illness,
Yes.
and it was unpublishable. We sat down for an hour and a half, and at the time I didn't have the sort of the interview confidence to say, hang on a minute, this is terrible for the layperson, and I just sort of let him talk for an hour and a half, and I remember listening back to it and going, this is useless.
Yeah.
So that never got published.
Well, no, I understand that. I mean, the thing is that, being clear about concepts and making conceptual analysis and so on, that can be important. But if it loses sight of the connection between, if it loses sight of the connection between that and ordinary everyday life, I think in the end it becomes academic in the worst sense of the term. It becomes difficult to see the point of it. So I do think there's a place for the highly abstract and rather difficult and technical side of philosophy. But if it can't find its way back to how could that help me think about my life, our life together, big questions of political organization and moral value, in the end, I think it just, turns on itself and serves no particular purpose. So that's, for me, something very, very important, to find the route back from philosophical reflection to ordinary everyday life. And in fact, I think the one emerges out of the other. I think that philosophical reflection is just trying to be clearer about kinds of questions that we ask ourselves in everyday life anyway. It's just taking those and dealing with them in a particular way.
Well, I mean, considering you sort of grew up in that environment where the philosophy, British philosophy, was around that sort of analytical tradition, and you were saying you wanted to ask these bigger questions like the meaning of life, etc. What first attracted you to philosophy? I mean, you've said what you're interested in now and what you study now, but have you always been like, and this might connect with what we'll talk about a bit later, have you always been quite introspective and thinking about these bigger questions? What was the initial draw to philosophy for you?
Well, I think excuse me, I think in a way that that I was born a philosopher. I was born somebody, excuse me, I need a glass of water. I think that I was, when I was very young, I was very reflective and would think a lot about the world and so on. And I guess also the other aspect of it was I, from a very young age, found the world very complex and difficult. And even as a boy, I had lots of very conflicting emotions. I was very subject to boredom, got angry a lot and that kind of thing. And that set off in me reflection about, where that came from, why I was like that, how that made life just complex and difficult for me. So I guess that from that point of view, I was always very reflective about myself and about other people and people's motives. I've always been interested in, as we say, what makes people tick, what's going on in people's minds and their motivations and so on. And I guess the other thing is that I grew up, I suppose, well, I certainly did have a Christian faith of a certain Catholic variety. I went to a Catholic secondary school. And when I was about 17, I lost my faith. And I think that was the other thing which finally made me turn to philosophy in an explicit way.
Why? What happened there? Why did
Well,
you?
it was, yeah, it was partly just a thing that often happens to young people when they get to 16, 17, and they start to, question and so on. It was also because my dad died of cancer around that time. So there was a lot of stuff going on. And then, this reflective nature I think I already had just made me. So I'd always been thinking in a way philosophically, but hadn't really heard of philosophy. And then I started to do some extra reading and discovered that there was this thing called philosophy. These were people who thought about the things I was thinking about. So I thought, oh, that's a good thing. I'm going to study that. And I'd originally wanted to go to university to read natural sciences, but I actually decided in the end to read philosophy instead. And so I read people like Nietzsche, as I mentioned earlier, and Sartre and Camus. And I don't think I understood, well, I know I didn't understand very much, but I felt incredibly excited. I felt these people were talking about something I could recognize. Sartre with his questions about mauvaise foi, bad faith, and self-deception. And there were chapters on sadism and masochism in his great work, Being and Nothingness. So I could see, although I couldn't really understand what he was saying, it took me a long time to get to grips with philosophy. I could see that these were topics that were kind of in the world that I could recognize as connecting with the kinds of worries that I had. And so I then decided to read philosophy at university. And I confess, as I said earlier, that I was rather disappointed because I was interested in these big, really big questions. And my teachers weren't really doing that kind of thing. But I guess later I had some very, very good teachers who allowed me and it helped me to think about these things for myself. And also because I guess I was just bloody minded and thought, I'm going to find a way to say something that I want to say in this subject. And then by the time I'd finished a PhD, of course, I was unemployable in any other way whatsoever. So I had to get a job as a philosopher, which was how I ended up teaching philosophy.
For you, has there been any sort of consequences to that level of introspection? With all the people I talk to on this podcast and in my personal life, there seems to be some sort of correlation between being introspective and being susceptible to things like anxiety and depression and those sort of things. Has that been the case for you?
Oh yeah, unquestionably. I mean, unquestionably, as I mentioned earlier, even as a boy, I experienced, boredom and anger, to a very great extent. And I think that, and I've certainly been through periods of, when I was very low in my life, and I've always found life extremely complex and difficult. So, I mean, one of the aspects of it, unquestionably, is that being very introspective is both cause and effect of having, some of these very rich emotional states and wanting to think about them and wanting to explore them. I think the other aspect of it is that one gets to a point also when one realizes that one has spent a huge amount of time reflecting and thinking, and sometimes there's a bit of a feeling of not having lived. You're thinking about living, but you're not really living. And I think that that's one aspect of my thinking about the nature of philosophy and how it fits into a life. That it can be something which is, kind of strangely distant in a way. You're thinking about life, but, I mean, basically to write books, as I've written books and studied and read a great deal, you have to spend a hell of a lot of time by yourself thinking about things. So, so it's a kind of strange kind of life in a way. And I remember when I was writing my PhD, I would sometimes have 4 or 5 days and the only time I would go out, I'd go out for a run to try and, just get rid of some physical energy. And then I'd come back and carry on. And after 4 or 5 days, I'd realize I hadn't even spoken to anyone. I'd just been at home or in a library or something, just. So, yeah, there are all kinds of very complex issues concerned with, devoting one's life to thinking and so on. But unquestionably, the connection with those emotional states is there. And, I think I've been through, pretty much the gamut of, everything from intense rapture and joy to, feeling pretty miserable and, what's the point of it all? And what I've tried to do is use that in my philosophical work, in some stuff that I've written, that's perhaps for an audience bigger than just an academic audience, but even the philosophers I'm interested in and on whom I've written, for a narrow, for, let's say, for in philosophy journals or that kind of thing. Philosophers that I've mentioned before, like Nietzsche or like Kierkegaard, these are people who similarly went through, very difficult times emotionally and so on. And I guess that without even really thinking about it, I recognized myself in them when I started reading them. And that was what attracted me to them. So one aspect of philosophy that I think about a lot is the way in which it can or can't capture these moments of rapture and ecstasy, including the rapture of misery, as it were.
Do you think it's excuse me? Do you think it's an inevitable consequence of being introspective is that you are going to inflict those sort of states of misery upon yourself? Or have you met philosophers that are able to sort of, talk about the meaning of life and existentialism and things like that, but still remain sort of inoculated and distanced from sort of getting emotionally involved in it?
Oh yeah, I mean, lots and lots of philosophers. I mean, these days philosophy is very largely, it's a discipline very largely that's taught at universities. It's, it has its, as Kierkegaard put it, it has its stages on life's way. You do a first degree, you do a second degree, you do a PhD or whatever, you get a job. It's perfectly possible to make a whole career out of thinking about even these, great tormented philosophers like Nietzsche, without oneself being tormented and treating it as an intellectual exercise. And indeed, modern bureaucratic organization of a university, in my view, encourages that. So yeah, I've met lots of philosophers who, so far as I was able to judge, I mean, I wouldn't know them perhaps completely intimately, but I don't think I'm wrong completely. Perfectly capable of talking about Nietzsche's utter wretchedness and then and write an interesting article on it, but themselves are not touched by that. I think that's, and I've certainly met other philosophers who write on the great figures of the tradition, for whom philosophy is an extremely interesting and intense intellectual activity, but doesn't really touch their life. And I mean, and that's partly because of the way the thing is encouraged. The thing is encouraged, philosophers are encouraged to think of it as an intellectual exercise, and can be, to use a term I used earlier, can often get a bit embarrassed by the idea that you could think of it as having a dimension, that was therapeutic or an aspect that was self-help or anything like that. That's still quite unusual view for philosophers to have. Most philosophers wouldn't think of philosophy as having that therapeutic intent. One interesting example is a guy called in France, I think he died quite recently, called Pierre Hadot, who wrote quite a lot on philosophy as a way of life. But he, his view is, I think, it's certainly not the mainstream view in English-speaking philosophy. I mean, there's no question about it.
Yeah, I've got to say, I just feel like every time I'm reading any sort of philosophy, I feel like I'm playing with fire, like I'm walking through a minefield. It's just, I'm going to stumble across one sentence or one paragraph that's just going to sort of push me over the edge into the abyss or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, maybe that's just my personality type. One question I've got before we get into the specifics of this, I'm sort of just indulging my own my own philosophical questions here. You might know that the source of this question. I'm thinking it's Plato, and it's it's on this idea of philosophizing and being introspective, and it was the question of whether it's better to be ignorant and happy, or to be informed and miserable. And from what I know, whoever it was posed that question, wrote about it, came down on the side of it's better to be informed and miserable. And I think about that a lot, because I think a lot of my anxiety was my thing. That's what I'm a professional at. And I think a lot of that was fueled by my own bizarre, I had a weird curiosity that sort of sprang up in my early 20s. philosophy, philosophical questions about life and meaning and things. And I think a lot of that reading and introspection was kind of a direct cause of what would sort of later befall me. And I've looked back on that and thought, I don't agree with that conclusion. If I could go back and never have read those books and just be sort of blindly going through life perfectly happy, I'd go for that. I'd value ignorance and happiness more. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, it was actually John Stuart Mill who said that. He said that it was better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied.
Right.
And that was in a context that he was drawing a distinction between what he called higher and lower pleasures. I mean, essentially for Mill, who was rather high-minded kind of man, though a marvellous man, I think, in a way. Distinction, the lower pleasures are, the obvious things, drink and sex and so on, food, and the higher pleasures of philosophy and poetry and music and so on. Well, what do I think about it? I think that I think that part of it is that for somebody like me, I am an introspective person. I don't think I have a choice, in the sense that that's just the life I have. So it's a kind of non-question, really. I mean, if somebody said to me, could I be, happy and happy-go-lucky and lose the introspection as part of that? Well, I'd say, well, yes, but there would be no more Christopher Hamilton. It's just part of what I am. It's so deeply bound up in me to think and reflect on things. But I suppose, of course, I can. If somebody said to me, I could give you the same life and you'd be the same person and really happy. Well, of course, I'd be tempted, but but I guess what I really think is that we don't really know what happiness is. The one can have moments and one feels happy, one feels joyful, or personally, I think the idea of peace of mind is a more interesting thing than happiness. But I guess at the end, it's a thing I've thought about a great deal, is that in the end, if somebody said to me, well, Christopher, have you had a happy life? I'm not sure I would know what to say. I know I've had moments when I was very low, moments of intense misery and feeling lost and everything's pointless and so on. Periods of life like that. I've also had periods where I felt, filled with incredible joy and exaltation and a kind of ecstasy. I mean, partly it's because I am personally a person of extremes. I tend to live in the extremes of experience. But what I do think, and what I think is in a way a more interesting thing, and I tried to write about this in a book a couple of years ago, is I think of my life as an incredible adventure. Some things have happened to me which I certainly regretted. I've certainly done plenty of things that I regret, as all human beings do. Times when I've been impatient, unkind, selfish, mean, and all of that. But I feel my life has been an extraordinary adventure, and in that sense, that seems to me in a way more valuable than the idea of being happy. And it seems to me that it's more a way of making one's own life one's own, to make it one. And there's a great line in the Roman poet Terence, in one of his plays, I think, where he says, somebody says, I am a human being and nothing human is alien to me. And I love that thought. I love the thought that even those moments of times of misery and desperation that I've had, they seem quintessentially human. And I feel they've given me something incredibly valuable, even if I can't always say, so often I can't say what it is. So I don't know. Of course, as I say, I'd be tempted by the idea of happiness, but I'm more tempted. I've been even more tempted by the idea of peace of mind, because that's what I don't have very much. And when I do have, it's funny, when I sometimes feel like I have peace of mind, I then suddenly think, what's wrong with me?
Yes, that is a definite hallmark of anxiety. When you're having a good day and you get suspicious. Hang on a minute.
There must be something wrong because I'm feeling all right, but I did. So yeah, I mean, it's a very, very complicated thing, and I think in any case, for a person, who's reflective and so there's just no way back to that kind of ignorance. There's just no way back to it. And when I look at people who don't reflect, I don't envy them. That's the honest truth. If I don't know anyone. I don't know anyone that I would consider having a life that I would envy, who seems to me straightforwardly happy, or the happiness comes from not reflecting, or something like that. I don't have that sense, so I don't really envy people from that point of view. But then envy is not an emotion to which I'm particularly prone. I mean, some people are, and that's another thing about one's own life. One recognises the particular emotions to which one, I mean, I have much a bigger problem with anger, for example. I get angry about the state of the world, or myself, or other people, and so on. Envy is not particularly an emotion that strikes me that much.
Right, okay, well, I think we've laid some pretty good, solid, big foundation stones there for what we're going to jump into. And so, we're, like I say, we're talking about midlife and the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
And so let's sort of hone in on that a little bit. And I guess the first thing to do would be to sort of establish some parameters of what we actually mean by midlife, and maybe what distinguishes it from youth and old age would probably be a good start. And maybe if there's well, I was going to say if we could sort of stick an age barrier there as well, but I don't think one exists. I mean, we'll talk about this, but you had your midlife crisis started at 38. I think mine started at 30. And actually, I think I think John Stuart Mill doing a bit of research. I think, didn't he say he had one when he was about 20 years old or something?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let's not worry so much about numbers, but just distinguishing middle age as its own sort of phenomenon.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right, and I mean, of course, it would be absurd if the idea of midlife crisis had no connection with a certain chronological age. But I do think, and so what one could say is that the typical patterns of mind and states perhaps tends to come out at a particular chronological age. But I think that it's absolutely true that the key thing is the state of mind. The American philosopher Stanley Cavell, in one of his books, which isn't particularly talking about middle age, but he does say that middle age is the time when you realize that the time for preparation is over and the world will take you for what you are. And I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, I think the thing about youth is that youth has this sense of the openness of existence, that the world is a kind of offers this huge range or gamut of possible avenues through life. And I think middle age is a time when you realize how things have shrunk. The kinds of choices that you've made have led you to a point where you're in a certain kind of life, and that's the life you're living. So I think that's part of it. So I think that can happen at an earlier age. I once gave a talk a few years ago on the concept of middle age to a group of just interested people, non-academics, and a young man afterwards, I think he was in his mid to late 20s, said to me that he felt he'd already was going through a midlife crisis because he had invested pretty much all of his energy since very young, when he was a teenager, in the idea of being a musician. And he'd got to a point where he realized he just didn't have the talent for it. It just wasn't going to happen. And so he had to reevaluate his life. And that made sense to me. I mean, it makes sense to me to think that this could happen at different times, where you suddenly feel that a way of living that you've had, it has become narrowed, and you're stuck with that way of life, and you've got to do something about it. And you can break, which is why the classic thing of the midlife crisis is, to go out and, everything from buying a fast car to traveling to Antarctica or whatever. It's just the idea of trying to break out of a certain kind of mold. And I personally think that there's something particularly about the modern age, where we live very ordered bureaucratic lives, and we spend a lot of time struggling to get to a particular point. And in my own case, the struggle to get a permanent job, to have some financial security, and so on. And then when you get all that, the classic question is, well, what do I do with it? And it's at that point where you can feel kind of trapped or blocked in your life. So I think that is a classic thing. I mean, Tolstoy in his book A Confession, which describes his own midlife crisis, what we would call a midlife crisis, though that term didn't exist for him. It was actually invented in 1965. And Tolstoy talked about the sense of his life grinding to a halt. And I think there is that. In his own case, it was also the sense of mortality. I mean, we all know we're going to die, but there's a difference between knowing it and kind of fully acknowledging it, or kind of living with that thought. And he suddenly had this sense of his life in that way. And he also just had this sense of, okay, so he was famous, he was wealthy, but that sense that one can have, what does it all add up to? How does it hang together? What does it mean, especially in the light, perhaps, of death? So, yeah, it's not a chronological age. It might be I think it probably is partly culturally linked as well. I think that it's probably something that happens to more people, in our kind of world, a world of where we essentially don't have to worry much about. We're very lucky in not having to worry much about, where the next meal is coming from, or having a roof over our heads. And so there is a fear, I suppose, one could have that having a midlife crisis is also a little bit, there's a certain self-indulgence. I mean, as you and I here are now talking, there are 800 million people with not enough food to eat. So thinking about these things could seem a bit self-indulgent, but nonetheless, they are a reality. People struggle with their mental lives as they struggle with their physical lives. And, if we live in a world in which we don't have to struggle with food and so on, we still have to struggle with that strange thing, which is the human mind, which to my mind is a bit like a sort of chattering monkey, that's constantly talking and so on. And it's very hard to keep it calm and so on. It's very distracting. And so I think, there are lots of those things that feed into the question of a midlife crisis.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about it is it's got to be also based on an assumption of one's own life expectancy.
Yes.
Obviously, I think in the UK now, I think it's around about 80 or something like that. And so I find it interesting that we sort of allow ourselves, and youth gives us that sort of sense of immortality, and that death is something that's so far off, it's inconceivable, and it's not even going to happen to us, it's going to happen to some sort of other future us. But the reason I find that particularly interesting is one of the sort of facets of my issues around anxiety was hypochondria. Obsessed with illness and death from a very early age. And so I kind of wonder whether I think my midlife crisis was, it struck at 30. And the reason it struck at 30, just quickly, was in my early 20s, I'd sort of written all these goals down, all these things that I would have, by 30, these are the things I want to have achieved. I think there's about 7 things, and some of them weren't, I was quite modest, actually, for a 21-year-old. It wasn't like I wanted to be out on a yacht with strippers snorting cocaine and stuff. Right. I had quite modest goals. And by the time I'd reached 30, I hadn't achieved any of them. And not a single one. And nowhere near. And coupled with this sort of hypochondriasis, this idea that I know I'm going to die early, I think that's what sort of did it for me. Yours struck at 38, and if you wouldn't mind sort of expanding on your story a little bit, and also why it became a midlife crisis, and I'll sort of preempt the story a little bit, but after you tell your story, it sounds like one of where you might question your own identity, but not necessarily it becoming a midlife crisis. So I'm interested how those two sort of tie together for you.
Yeah, well, so the story is that when I was 38, so I'm one of 6 children, and I'm the 5th. So I just have one younger brother, 3 older brothers, and an older sister. In fact, my sister is the eldest in the family. And when I was 38, I was told by my oldest brother, so the second child, that in fact the man I had taken to be my father my whole life, in fact, wasn't my father, and that I was the only one in the family of the 6 siblings who had a different father. And my real father was a man I actually already knew, because he had been my teacher at school. my mother had a relationship with him because two of my older brothers went to that school. It was a primary school, and she had met him, I presume, at a parents' evening or something like that. He lived quite close to us, and they started an affair, which I think lasted 2 or 3 years, and I'm the product of that affair. And then my parents, that's to say, not my biological father, of course, and my mother tried to patch up their marriage, and they had another son, who's my younger brother. And so I didn't know about this until I was 38. And so what was devastating about it was, firstly, to realize that I had a different father. Secondly, I discovered that my 4 older siblings had known my whole life who my real father was, and that actually the other man wasn't my father. And they'd concealed that from me for reasons which I understood. They thought that they wanted to protect me. Could understand that. And then discovering that my real father had, in fact, been my teacher at school, at primary school, was devastating, because I knew this man, and in fact, during my teaching career, had thought of him on 2 or 3 occasions. I remember, bizarrely enough, actually having told a group of pupils. It was when I spent 4 years as a secondary school teacher before teaching at university. Telling a group of pupils an anecdote about this man, not knowing that I was speaking about my father, and in fact had often thought that he'd made a tremendous impression on me, because he was because I felt, I teach rather in a way that he did, not knowing, as I say, that I was thinking about my father. So, and I eventually tracked him down. He was still alive. He was an old man. He was over 80 by the time I tracked him down. I should say the man I thought had been my father, in fact, died when I was 17, or maybe just 18. I'm not sure. No, I think I was 17. And anyway, my real father, my biological father, I tracked him down, and I think he was too old to bother putting up any resistance, and didn't want to anyway. And he accepted me as his son, and we met on a few occasions, a couple of times a year, 2 or 3 times a year, before he died at, I think, the age of about 84, 85. So your question, yes. So obviously that for me was crucial in changing my sense of identity. I mean, part for lots of reasons, some of them obvious. I mean, one of them perhaps more obvious. Well, I don't know how obvious it is anyway, but I mean, I began to realize that large features of my personality seemed to me to have come directly from my biological father. For example, he was a person very interested in books and languages. Indeed, he'd been my French teacher at school. And that had been my life. My life had been books and ideas and languages and so on. And so that made me feel this was kind of built into me. Similarly, he has he's now died, as I say, 3 children by his wife, 2 of whom became teachers, and 1 of whom had done some teaching. So I had to become a teacher, and so that gave me a very strong sense that although it looked to me as if I'd chosen this career, actually it was just something that was in me, a kind of predilection, a tendency. But also the loss of identity with my brothers, the sense of the change of my relationship to them. So, and that precipitated me into what I thought of as a midlife crisis, because it essentially precipitated me into the question, who am I? And that seems to me central to the midlife crisis, because the midlife crisis, as I said earlier, was about this idea of being, finding one's life coming to a grinding to a halt, or one feels blocked, or that revolves around the question, who am I? Who am I and what am I doing with myself? And that was exactly my question as well. Who am I and what am I doing with myself? How much of what I've done have I really chosen? How much of it has just happened to me because I happen to be this kind of person, the sheer contingency of being the kind of person I am, and so on. And so for me, and then I realized that, as it were, from the starting point of feeling these questions of identity, I realized that I'd been thrown into the general questions, as I say, about midlife. What am I doing in my life? Could I live a different kind of life? Could I have lived a different kind of life? What other choices are there ahead of me? How much of what I've done has actually been my choice, or I've just been sort of following out a pattern because my father was who he was? So that was how it developed. And I had, in fact, originally thought, because after the first initial shock was over, I decided, in order to try and understand my experiences, to do some writing about this, and eventually was then invited to write a book, a particular book in a series. And there was a particular topic that was suggested to me, and I said, look, I'm not interested in this, but I would quite like to write about this thing about middle age. And fortunately, the commissioning editor was happy for me to do that. So that's how I came to write about the book. Came to write the book and write about this topic. And it did a great deal to help me put into place and to place some of my thoughts and feelings about this whole experience.
I'm interested how we've kind of talked about this, the idea of how the midlife crisis sort of manifests.
Yes.
And it's leather jackets, it's a sports car, it's hanging out in clubs trying to pick up younger girls, that sort of thing. So I mean, on a personal level, was there any sort of manifestation or quote unquote symptoms of the midlife crisis for you? And then more broadly, do you think there's anything to the leather jackets and sports car thing? And if so, what is that all about? What's the purpose of it?
Well, I think I think it's not a very original thought, but I think with sports cars and the leather jacket, it's the desperate attempt not to lose one's youth. I mean, I think that crucial to the midlife crisis is the sense of one's mortality. Especially, and that it happened in your case, as you said, when you were younger, but you'd always been concerned by these things. But I think the general thing is when you really realise I'm going to die. I mean. And I think that that's something that can, once you realise it in that way, never quite goes away. I mean, in my case, it's continued with a sense of, well, now I've got to a point in life where I know, unless I live to be a very, very old man, well over 100, I've passed more of my life. I've got more of my life behind me than in front of me. I'm 52 now, and that thought I find utterly terrifying. And I think that. I really genuinely try not to think about it, because I can wake up in the middle of the night and feel a sense of panic.
Yeah, I get that though. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. I've read quite a bit about it. Yeah. A few people have this experience where they wake up in the middle of the night, sort of spring up in bed like, "Oh my God, I'm going to die," but you really feel. Yeah. It's a real realization of that sort of eternal nothingness that awaits us.
Yeah, exactly. And we're laughing about it now, but it's the laughter of the damned, I'm afraid.
It's true.
I think the sports cars and so on. I think it's an attempt to break out of a kind of claustrophobic situation where you feel you boxed yourself into a particular room. I wrote very briefly in the book about when I was a very young man. I mean, in my teens, I had a girlfriend whose father, as I now recognise, was going through a midlife crisis. But I was too young far too young then to understand that, what was going on with him and so on. But he went out and bought a flashy car and so on, and I can remember his wife, so this girlfriend's mother, sort of joking about it, and I didn't really know what she was talking about when she said, "Oh, he's going through a midlife crisis," but it was clear that he was, and I think it was, in his own case, he had a passion for photography, and I think that he had felt that and acting actually, if only he had pursued those, but there he was doing a rather boring job. And so I don't think he bought a leather jacket, but the car was an attempt to break out of, and do something that, and I think it's connected with we lead lives of extraordinary order, in offices and so on. And yet there's something in us all which thrills to the idea of, rapture and energy and speed and so on. And I think that he was probably, I think that in midlife one can have a very, very strong sense of the need of those things, because youth usually has that, that kind of immensely energetic relationship to each other and to the world and so on. I mean, just as I was writing last week, there was a lot of snow, of course, and I was writing something up in my office at home, and I looked out of the window and saw these boys coming back from school, and the way they were larking around with the snow and pushing each other and so on. There was just an incredible vitality and energy there, which, when you get older, you just simply don't have in the same kind of way. Or your head is filled with, oh, I've got to get home because I've got to do the shopping, or, I've got to look after the kids or cook the meal or something, so that sense of a sort of dynamic energy, which I think we can all admire and long for, is the lack of which can seem, the lack of that can seem extremely powerful in middle age. So I think that, the fast cars and the leather jackets, I understand it as a manifestation of that kind of longing. I mean, I didn't get involved in any of that, to be honest. I think in my own case, I just felt, to me, it didn't really have much manifestations in that way. It was much more, I mean, I felt very low. I felt very depressed. And I'm quite a keen runner, and I do quite a lot of running each week. And I ran even more then. I can remember doing hours and hours of running, and there was this sense of, I felt almost as if I wanted to vomit out of myself some of these emotions of, because my feelings were feelings of loss of identity, this sense of who I am. It didn't really manifest itself in me in the fast cars and so on. On the other hand, what I would say is that it has given me, since once the main trauma passed, it's given me a much more acute sense than I've ever had of taking pleasure in kind of ordinary things. Going on holiday, lying on a beach, swimming, having a drink, staying in a nice hotel. And I'm lucky; I've got some money for the first time in my life, to indulge some of those things. And so I have much more of a sense now of being able to appreciate some kind of completely ordinary things. And in the past, so for example, now, if it's sunny outside and it's warm air, in the past I used to look at it and think that's nice and then go back to reading my book. But now I find that much more difficult. Now I think, okay, look, the sunny day, there won't be an infinite number of sunny days. And I've got to go out and make something of this. And I'm more capable than I used to be of appreciating that kind of thing, which is a good thing that's come out, I think.
Yeah, I think it was the same for me, really. I don't think mine, my midlife crisis, I think at the age of 30, I'd probably still be able to get away with leather jackets and a sports car, but it didn't manifest itself that way for me. It was just a deepening introspection and a lot of self-blame and regret and things like that. I've got to say though, I'm a bit conflicted on this idea of the manifestation of this midlife crisis, because on the one hand, we've got this idea of, we make fun of the guy that buys the sports car or whatever, or wants to, start a band. But then, because those are the things that we sort of associate with youth, and like you were saying, the speed and excitement and those youthful aspects. But part of me thinks, well, who gives a shit what anyone thinks? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you want to do those things, then sort of to hell with what everybody else thinks. I guess the question mark against it is whether, do you think that those attempts are these shallow attempts? Are they disingenuous, and that's really what the problem is?
No, I don't think they necessarily are. I think there's probably, I mean, I should say at a general level, I agree with you. I mean, if somebody wants to do those kinds of things, I mean, I really don't care. But I do think, so I think there are two things say against it, though, as it were. I mean, one is, of course, that people sometimes do this and it hurts other people. You know, the classic thing is the guy who leaves his wife and has an affair with a young girl, and it's obviously a disaster, and it's, you know, and he's being a fool and so on, and everyone can see that. You know, and the wife is left there miserable, sometimes with the kids. I mean, that, of course, brings in another dimension. It's fast cars and jackets and so on, leather jackets. I mean, who cares? But if part of the price for that is being paid by, somebody with whom one has spent 20 or 30 years, then of course that's complicated, and that raises objections. I think the other thing is, though, that as I say, notwithstanding the fact that, and leaving out that first point, that if people want to do that, that's fine. Well, maybe, I think it would depend on the case. I could imagine somebody doing that, and I'd say, great, he's having a wonderful time. It'll probably pass. Who cares? But I could imagine cases also where people are doing that, and it seems all a bit silly and a bit desperate and a bit pitiful. So I think it would depend really on the particular case. Actually, a very good example of that is Woody Allen's film Hannah and Her Sisters. You know, where one of the central characters, played by Michael Caine, has an affair, in fact, with his wife's sister. And before he has this affair, and while he's having this affair, he's, as he puts it at the end, utterly convinced that he couldn't live without her. And then realizes that this isn't, in fact, so at all, that it was a kind of bid to escape, and he never did fully leave his wife, and so on. And so people can, do ridiculous and foolish things. And I guess that what I think is, it's probably quite good if, even when one sees that somebody's being foolish and so on, to have a certain pity or compassion for it, because life is so confusing and difficult, that in a way it's not surprising. I mean, I'm usually surprised that how many human beings manage to keep their lives going normally on track, given what strange creatures we are with this chattering monkey mind. So in a way, it's not surprising. And as I say, leaving out the whole issue of maybe a wife or children and how they might be hurt by these things, which is obviously a deeply complicating factor.
Do you think there's anything to the idea that maybe we overvalue youth? And what I mean by that is, I guess, statistically, you are likely to live a long life, but it's not guaranteed to you. That's the one thing. Youth doesn't equal that. It's not an inoculation from death or demise.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's, you sort of mentioned it before, this idea that when you reach middle age, your options have shrunk.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering to whether or not we feel that isn't necessarily a reflection of whether or not that's actually true. This idea that when you're young, the world's your oyster. But truth be told, when you turn, you turn 50 years old, you've still got 30, 40, this generation, maybe 50 years of life left in you. So this idea that your options have shrank seems sort of misinformed. And especially for generations nowadays that are living longer and longer. I just wonder whether we sort of, we overvalue youth in that sense. And what do you think?
Well, I think that, so what do I think? I think that if somebody said to me, as I said, I'm 52 now, if somebody said to me, I can take you back and make you 30, but you will still know what you know now, you'll still have your sense of what life is, then I would say, okay, I'd be happy to go for it. But there's a trade-off. I mean, in that sense, I think that, do we overvalue youth? Well, I think that it's completely normal to want youth. I mean, youth is full of energy. youth does have a sense of life as being open and exciting and so on. Of course, we probably forget also some as we get older some of the confusions that we had at that time. But I think that if we want to say that getting older can bring some benefits, then I think we should do that while remembering that it's a very natural and normal thing to want youth and to lament the loss of youth because of that. The boys playing in the snow that I was mentioning earlier, that sense of that energy and so on. On the other hand, of course, in many ways, you're right. The opportunities that one has at a later stage. I mean, for example, I mentioned earlier that probably in the last maybe 7 or 8 years, I've had some disposable income, which I didn't have before then. So I've got opportunities to do things, to travel, to go places that I couldn't have done when I was younger. Not simply because I didn't have the disposable income, which I didn't, but also because I didn't have the confidence in myself. I mean, for example, when I have a research leave from the university, I'm very lucky to have this. Every couple of years, I get a term free, and I obviously have to do certain things. I have to write and research and so on, but I can go anywhere, and I go abroad. I usually go abroad, and I have the confidence in myself as an older man now, as a middle-aged man, to do that. I wouldn't have had that confidence when I was 30. Probably not. Well, at any rate, when I was about 32, when I was about 30, I did go and study abroad for a couple of years, but that was very different. Things were organised for me. It was much easier in a certain way. So I think there are tremendous opportunities one can have when one is older. I think the other thing, though, but I think there are aspects of being trapped. I mean, for example, one thing I would love to do is, because I think it's a tremendous problem, is to work for an environmental organisation or an organisation which is concerned with animal welfare or something like that. That would seem to me a very pointful activity to do. But I can't do that and, for example, keep the house that I've got, because the house that I've got, which I've worked tremendously hard to get the down payment, the deposit to buy the house and so on. I couldn't, I needed a reasonable salary to pay the mortgage. So I'm trapped insofar as that's the choice. The choice is either I could, downsize or go and live in a rented place or whatever and give up this thing that I actually gives me security and a certain material sense of, the hard work I've done in my life. Or I say, okay, I live with the compromise that I've got. And I think one's choices are more limited in certain ways, even though in other ways they're much broader. And there are people who are probably braver than I am who would say, okay, I'll sell the house, and I heard on the radio a man he'd got to a midlife crisis. It was really funny. And he said, I got to a point where I realized I was living in a house too big for my needs, full of stuff I didn't really want or need, inviting people I didn't really like around for dinner all the time, doing a job I didn't really want to do. And he said, I'd always wanted to be a sailor. So I bought a boat. I got rid of everything. And now I run my own business, taking people on, trips around the world on the sea. And I thought, well, that's, incredibly brave. But he had a lot of money to do it. So that which certainly helped. So I do think there's something to be envied in youth. But I also think that there are good things about being older, even though I do think there is also a feeling of being trapped. And of course, the other thing that traps people, I mean, this doesn't apply to me because I don't have children, but people, with children, they've got huge responsibilities. They can't, if you take those responsibilities seriously, you can't just sell it all up and go and become a sailor. It just, that's, or get the leather jacket and the fast car.
Yeah, there's definitely something in that. I think the other thing about middle age is it's a time when you sort of there's more variables in your life than there's sort of ever been before. There's, like you say, it's a time when people are actually getting mortgages and they're getting married, long-term relationships, these kids, but you're also bookended by two generations that are, depending on your personal circumstance, but I think it's quite common that you're bookended by two generations that are both, you're responsible for their well-being. Yeah. I'm certainly in that position where I've got two kids that, require a lot of care and attention. But my parents as well, they're getting to that age where they need my help a lot. And I think it's also besides them sort of variables of responsibility, I think it's middle age is where you're starting to be introduced to the tragedy of existence, so to speak. Bones are getting creaky. People are
Yes.
starting to get sick and die and things like that. I think maybe that's another aspect of it.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, in that sense, as you say, of parents and children, and also one's own body starting to get older, and I mean, I mentioned earlier I do a lot of running, and I'm lucky that I'm basically in good physical shape, but nonetheless, I don't have quite the physical energy I had 10 years ago. It takes me longer to recover from a long run. So I have to think about, am I going to, if I do this in the morning, maybe it's going to blow away some of the time I would use in the afternoon to study. So how am I going, stuff like that makes a real difference, I think. So yeah, I think there is a genuine truth in the idea that in middle age one is more trapped, despite the fact that with a bit of luck, one has some opportunities one wouldn't have had otherwise. And in my own case, as I say, the thing I feel very lucky about is I feel more confident in myself generally, than I did 15 or 20 years ago. But that's nothing I've done. It's just knocking around the world a bit longer.
Well, one thing people might have noticed during this discussion is there's been sort of an inherent gender bias going on.
Yes, I was thinking that
Yeah,
earlier.
towards men. We're talking about leather jackets and sports cars and things. I'm just wondering, with your research, with the book you wrote, did you cover anything to do with the female perspective, and what do you think that is? I mean, just from my observation of it, is that, well, women don't have that midlife crisis, especially, or at least not to the extent or the extreme that guys seem to. But I don't know. I'll pass that one over to you.
Yeah, well, to be perfectly honest, and I should be honest, I didn't do any special research or thinking about that. It's certainly true, I think, that the literature and the books that are written on this stuff tend to be written by men, and there tends to be a very strong male perspective on this thing. I think one reason for that might be, and this is speculation, but it might be because I think for women, particularly in the modern age, there's a related crisis which comes earlier, which is the thing about having children. Because, of course, men can go on having children much, much later in life, really to the end of life, if they're lucky. Whereas women, have to make choices in their early, mid-30s. They have to, and so I think the pressure on them to think about how they organise their lives is somewhat different. How they balance, do they want a child at all, and if so, when? How are they going to make that fit into the idea of a rich life, either a career or in some other way? And so I think that probably this is just a speculation. I may be entirely wrong, and I'm certainly open to being corrected on it. But I think that women probably experience something that we may not call the midlife crisis, but probably is that. But it just manifests itself in a different kind of way around these questions of childhood and career and so on. And there's no question that can be, a terrible problem for women. It's a terrible moment of crisis, of difficulty. It can be. But it's absolutely true that as I say, the kind of literature written on this stuff tends to be written by men, and about men. And I wonder whether women would experience the midlife crisis in quite the same way. As I say, I think this whole issue of children for them is different. I think the other thing for women is, and this is something that women often say about themselves, is the sense of getting older and suddenly they think of themselves as having much less appeal to men than they had when they were younger. My own view, by the way, is that that's a certain kind of illusion. Actually, I don't think it's always true by any means. There are plenty of older women who are, fabulously attractive and appealing, and partly because they've had experience of life and so on. But I think a lot of women feel that, and I think we live in a culture. You were talking earlier about the valuing of youth. I think that's probably even stronger for women than it is for men. So that women probably can feel, maybe by the time they're in their 40s, that people are just not paying attention to them in the same kind of way. And I've heard many, many women say that. And so I think that there's the youth. The thing about youth is probably even stronger for them than it is for men.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's definitely there's something societal based there with this idea that for women it's to you have to stay young and beautiful,
Yeah.
and for men, you have to have achieved, you have to have these material possessions or a certain amount of power or whatever. But just to, this is going to sound like a sort of a shallow comedic reassurance, but there's something in it. We were just talking about this idea that women feel that they reach a certain age and they've got less appeal, which is definitely an illusion. It's something that I think women seem to think about themselves, and it's definitely something that's sort of reflected in the media. But the media opinion definitely doesn't reflect the opinion of men. And what I mean about this sort of my comedic sort of statistic that backs that up is, I think it was just last year. It was shown. I think it was Google did these
Right.
analytics actually. That the term MILF and mature women on porn sites is it's the number one search term that men are looking for on those websites, which, like I say, it sounds quite a funny statistic to throw out there, but there's an interesting sort of psychological basis to that's maybe interesting to examine. Not in this conversation, we won't, but
I don't know about that, but I was thinking that one of the things that was very interesting was when Macron was elected as president of France. Of course, his wife is significantly older than he is, and there were these huge, debates in the media about this, and yet, of course, nobody bats an eyelid if an older man is with a younger woman, and that shows a lot of bias. That shows a lot of prejudice, and that probably does articulate very strongly that sense of the pressure there is on women to be youthful. And it also illustrates, of course, the illusion. I mean, his wife is an attractive older woman. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But there we are. So I imagine that these problems play out slightly differently for women.
Okay, so quite a big question, this one. Before I want to get into some sort of practical advice,
Right.
About what to, if you're in a midlife crisis, what to sort of do about it.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to articulate this, and it's going to be purely a speculative answer, I'm guessing. But what we talk about this idea of, we reach this point in midlife where we're wondering about who we are. These big questions: who am I? What is the meaning of life? Has my life up to this point meant anything, etc.? From a Darwinian perspective, those questions seem pointless. That as far as the organism is reproducing and it's living and breathing, from a Darwinian perspective, that's all that matters. I know these ideas of sort of dominance hierarchies, which have got a psychological component to them, which are Darwinian in and of themselves. But that still doesn't. Those questions of sort of attaining power within a group and survival, that they don't seem to take into account or to include those huge questions of what's the meaning of life? What does my life mean? Who am I? I'm just wondering what you think is the point of those questions to us. Why do we ask those questions?
Oh, I think that I don't think there is a reason. My own view is that we're just thrown up by evolution, these very strange creatures that we are, human beings, and that we have very big brains relative to other animals, which are incredibly good in general at surviving and incredibly bad at just about everything else. So we've just got this surfeit. We've got this surfeit of mental energy that has no particular purpose whatsoever. It's just thrown up as a sort of byproduct of an evolutionary process. And so I don't think there is any point, and I certainly don't think that any kind of evolutionary biology has got anything much to say about why we're the kinds of creatures with these strange questions. That's looked at from an evolutionary point of view. I think we just turn out to be these strange creatures who have these kinds of questions. From as it were, a more metaphysical point of view, well, I think it's just built into the kind of human creatures that we are, that human beings are that kind of creature that puts itself into question, that we ask ourselves these kinds of questions. We are the being for whom the question, what are we, who are we, is just built into what we are. And I think there's just simply no way we can avoid that. Of course, that doesn't mean that every single person asks himself or herself that question all the time, but it's just part of what it is the human condition, that we can't stop, can't give up that question: who am I? What am I? And questions which come out, but actually very strongly in adolescence as well as in middle age. I think there's a certain parallel between the two. So I don't think it has any purpose. I think it's just the strange thing that we are, the strange kind of creature that we are. But that we can't stop being that. We can't stop being that. There's no way we can just decide we're not going to care about the meaning of our lives. It's just built into us.
I just wonder if it's maybe something to do with, if you sort of go back into the past and you've got the two cavemen sort of living side by side or living contemporaneously, and maybe it's just that the caveman that doesn't attach meaning to his life maybe won't fight for it as hard as the caveman that did feel that there was some sort of meaning to his life. Again, I don't know, pure speculation, but
I would, I would not want. I think evolutionary biology has got some really interesting and helpful things to say, and I certainly think it's true that any account of what human beings are will have to take that into account. But it will only get us so far. I think my own view is that the explanations offered by evolutionary biology leave a huge gap. That's to say, they can explain some very basic things about us, but they can't explain why it is that we're the kinds of creatures with these, peculiar questions that we have. That just seems to me something that we just happen to be, as it were, something that just comes out of the kinds of creatures that we are. And that's what we have to live with. So I wouldn't myself accept that kind of, an account in terms of evolutionary biology. I would think of it more in terms of, the fact that human beings are, for example, it seems to me clear. I mean, we are desiring creatures. We're creatures with desire. And we could imagine a utopia in which all our desires would be satisfied. But in that utopia, we'd be bored. And the consequence of that is that we're thrown between desire and boredom. I think those two things are in conflict in human beings. And that inevitably raises the question, well, then, what is the meaning of all this? Who am I? It comes from human psychology, from these conflicts within ourselves. And that's why in some of my work, I've described human beings as ontological misfits. We're kind of not at home in the world. We don't make sense. We're a kind of oddity, a strange creature. And I don't think evolutionary biology can explain that, though it can certainly say some things about certain parameters within which we have to live, given the biology that we have.
So, getting sort of practical now. So, say if we imagine we've got somebody out there that's feeling this way, sort of regardless of what age you're actually at, but you've sort of reached a point which you feel at crisis, and you don't know the meaning of your life, you don't know what to do moving forward.
Yeah.
I mean, well, firstly, how did you get through your midlife crisis? And have you got any sort of general advice, perspectives, philosophies for people to at least get them off to the right start, or make the right approach towards rectifying it?
Well, in my case, unquestionably, a thing that helped enormously was to write about it. As I say, I wrote this book entitled Middle Age, and I wrote the book. And that did a huge amount to help me think in a kind of more or less structured way about what I was experiencing. So I think that one practical thing is people can do is write. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to publish a book or anything, but just to write down their thoughts. I think articulating one's thoughts on paper or on a computer screen is a really good way of getting some kind of clarity and order and distance. So I think that's important. I think the other thing is read what other people have written about it. And that's important for all kinds of reasons. Probably the most important is just not to feel alone. I think people who go through this feel, we all go through life thinking that other people are sorted out in a way that we're not. And so I think reading about other people and recognizing that this is a very, very common thing is important. I think also, trying to remember simply to be interested in the world out there. One can become, and I mean, this is a thing by which I've been afflicted most of my life, but being overly introspective. And so trying to remember, the world out there, when the sun is shining, go outside, go and look at it, go and enjoy it. and don't go too much, I would say, in search of pleasure, but be open to pleasure that comes along and take it, when it arrives, because seeking pleasure is usually self undermining activity. Nothing much comes of it. As Samuel Johnson said, there's nothing so foolish as a scheme of merriment. We all know that idea. I'm gonna have a great time tonight, and it doesn't happen. But sometimes great times happen when you're not expecting them. So being open to that kind of thing, I think, was helpful to me. Yeah, they're very simple things, but I think some of those things might help. And also, reading the great stuff. I mean, reading Tolstoy's A Confession about his own midlife crisis is incredibly consoling, because you can see that this great genius who had everything experienced very, very similar things. And so I think those kinds of texts are very helpful in thinking about this thing. And also the thing I was saying earlier about seeing one's life as an adventure. This is miserable, but it will pass, and it's an incredibly enriching experience if you just hang in there for the ride, as it were. And the other thing I would say is think twice or even three times before buying that leather jacket or the fast car or the motorbike.
I think my advice on that one, on the convertible sports car or whatever, would be, if you're buying it because you genuinely want to own this sports car or whatever it is, and it's not a sort of shallow attempt at sort of reclaiming youth. If it's genuinely something you want to do, and like you pointed out, it's not harming the other people in your life, I say go for it, and bollocks to what the societal standards are for what you should be doing at a particular age.
Well, I agree with that. So what I would say is, don't increase the mortgage on your house in order to buy it, because probably somebody else will end up paying the extra rent, the extra mortgage. Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. I agree with that completely.
The other one is, I suppose a lot of people think of this idea of a bucket list, which I'm sort of conflicted on, because I do think there's something to planning something. You write stuff down and you plan it and you stick a date on it, and it's more likely to get done. But also there's on the flip side, there feels a sort of a race against death going on as well, which for me would sort of taint the experience.
I've never made such a list, and I wouldn't, because I would think I would have the sense of the inevitable failure. I couldn't possibly fulfill those things, because it's the nature of such lists that they usually. But if they're smaller things, like having a particular kind of holiday or whatever, fine. But if you're going to set yourself some, huge, or maybe you were saying earlier that you've gone back to study, to study for a certain period of time, that that's doable, that's realistic. But there might be other things that one could set oneself, and they would just be a recipe for self-frustration, because you actually just not going to get it. So if you do a list, try and be as realistic as you can about it, I guess.
All right, so just quickly, because I know you've got another call in like 10 minutes. We talked about this just before we started recording. Kieran Satia wrote a book on the midlife crisis, and I think you'll be able to explain this better than me, so I'll just sort of throw it over to you. From what I gather, the conclusion that he came to was this sort of this Aristotelian distinction between engaging in complete or incomplete activities. They were called telic and atelic or something.
Telic and atelic. Yeah, his thought is a very nice thought, which is that it's a bit like the thought I just had about pleasure, actually. I think it's a version of that. And his thought is that if you're constantly aiming for particular goals, then, of course, once you achieve the goal, then you're going to feel a sense of emptiness because the goal is achieved. So what you should try and do is to think of the activities that you do as having a value simply in the doing of them. And I mean, it's a kind of mindfulness, and I think I think it's a valuable thought to have, that one should try, not always to aim for particular things. Or, if your aim, one of his examples is, if you're aiming to write a philosophy book, then of course that's a particular goal. But what you should really be trying to do is enjoying the philosophy as you're writing the book, rather than just thinking that the main thing is to get the book written. Yeah, and I mean that seems to me true, because, and it goes back, actually, I'm not sure that he mentions this in the book, but it goes back to 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who says that really we spend a great deal of our lives distracting ourselves. Um, and that actually we think that what we want is some particular thing achieved, but what we really want is the chase. And it's losing ourselves in the chase. And the example he gives is, he's talking in the 17th century, noblemen who go out for the day to chase hare or deer or whatever. He says, if you gave them in the morning the hare that they want to catch or the deer they want to catch, they wouldn't want that, because it's the catching of the deer,
Yeah,
the catching of the hare that they want. And they want to spend their time doing that. So that Pascal thinks we suffer from this thing where we think that what we really want is the end goal of the action, but it isn't really that. It's the chase that we want. It's the activity itself. And the thought you mentioned about telic and atelic activities is really the same thing. It's the idea of the importance of thinking in terms of the activity itself, being mindful about the activity itself that's important, not simply aiming for its end goal. And as I say, it's like the thing I said about pleasure. Instead of seeking for some particular pleasure, be open to the pleasure as it just comes along. Be open to experience as it's there, as it exists. And that seems to me very difficult, but very valuable.
Okay, so quickly with this
Yeah.
last 5 minutes, I've usually got like 8 or 10 quick fire questions. I'm going to cut these down to 4
Right.
and try and bang through these nice and quickly. The first one is, and I don't know if there's going to be an answer to this apart from yours and Kieran
Yeah.
Satia's, is have you got any book recommendations? But it can be either on this subject or just anything else you feel would be of value to the listeners.
Well, I would definitely recommend Tolstoy's A Confession, which I think is marvelous. And I think also his Anna Karenina is just an incredible study of midlife in various ways. The other classic Russian bit of literature is Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, which is a marvelous exploration of midlife. The central character, Vanya, is suffering the classic midlife crisis, and that's worth looking at. It's a marvelous play.
Okay, the 3 biggest questions I like to ask people then. The first one is, what's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Have low expectations.
Really? Okay. Pessimism. Is that do you think there's genuine value in that?
Yeah, I do. I think that we live, particularly in the modern age, we live in a world of comfort in many ways, and we have very high expectations. So I think lowering one's expectations, if one can, is a good thing. Yeah, it's a genuine piece of advice. Yeah. I'm very bad at it myself, by the way, but it doesn't alter the fact that it's a valuable piece of advice.
Okay. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Outside of family and academia. Oh, I think
family and career are always the default.
Yeah, so. No. Swimming in the sea. I feel absolutely fabulous when I swim in the sea.
Okay. Last but not least.
Yeah.
We might have already answered this, so have a crack at something different just for the sake of it. What do you think is the key to happiness?
The key to happiness is to forget the question about what makes me happy and just get on with life.
Okay.
Nice. Don't even think about it. Don't even think about what makes me happy. Just get on with life. Throw yourself into life.
See that? Well, they're quite. They sound quite easy. Lower your standards and forget.
Really difficult. They're really difficult things to do.
Yeah. Okay, Christopher Hamilton. Thank you very much for joining me. Have you got any links you'd like to direct the listeners towards? Any social media websites, anything like that?
Well, the only thing is that on my so there are quite a lot of. So you could look at my link in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London, which contains links also to many talks that I've done for the Institute of Art and Ideas. And you can also look at their website, the Institute of Art and Ideas, and there are lots of links on there. Search for my name, and if people are interested, I've done lots of talks there. So yeah, those are something.
Right, okay, perfect. Well, as always, I will include all those links in the show notes, including the books we've mentioned. So, yeah, Christopher Hamilton, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was tremendous, really tremendous pleasure talking to you. Take care.